Okay, everybody, continuing the world's quickest, but it's not really so much, ecology review. This is going to be for part two. Community ecology. In my mind, this was going to be the second PowerPoint you viewed over the summer. I don't know when you actually viewed it, but at any rate, this is ecology dealing with communities, many different species in a localized place. And essentially questions we've been trying to answer is how do the different populations of species interact with each other, for example, around this watering hole. And so that is referring to interspecific, meaning between different species, like an interstate takes you from one state to another on the highway. All right. There are many ways in which different populations interact in a community. One is they may compete with each other for resources, they may predate on one another, eat each other, or they may engage in more complex symbiotic relationships, which we'll talk about soon. Okay, as far as competition is concerned, you might just want to remember what this phrase means: competitive exclusion. And that just means whatever your resource is. For example, in this very poor picture, the resource is insects. Okay, and you might have two competitors, birds and frogs. Okay, and what this is saying is that no two competitors can occupy exactly the same niche at the same time. So you may have, and these two aren't exactly very similar, but you could have two very similar species, but they must be at least slightly different, or else one of them is always going to outcompete the other, and eventually the other will lose out. So they must be doing something slightly different. Resource partitioning is often how organisms come to deal with that idea of competitive exclusion. In this case, you've got a bunch of really similar, all of the same genus lizards, but some of them live up in the canopy, some of them live down low in the forest, and what that means is even though they look like, to us, we might see them all in the same general kind of habitat, but in fact they are not competing with each other, because these guys are eating the critters that are up high in the trees, these guys are eating down low, and so they have these little micro habitats, if you will, where they inhabit in close proximity but not competing for the exact same resources in the same exact place. Alright, you need to know what symbiotic interactions are. There are three main types. A symbiotic relationship is one in which two organisms are engaged throughout their lives. It may be parasitism. In this case, what you're seeing is a wasp laying its eggs in a caterpillar, and then the young of the wasp basically nourish off the caterpillar until they are themselves able to become wasps, adult wasps. Of course, the poor caterpillar doesn't fare very well. Parasitism. One benefits the wasp, the other is harmed, the caterpillar. A dog with a tick, same thing. The dog is being harmed, the tick is doing well. This is a really gross picture of a baby bird that is being parasitized by a type of fly. And this is brood parasitism we're seeing here, where a brown-headed cowbird has laid its eggs in the nest. I believe this is a little bird called a vireo. You can see the bird that's supposed to be here is many times smaller than this cowbird, and eventually the cowbird, usually the parents for this little guy feed this guy just like it was theirs, but it's not, and he's so much larger he usually ends up killing off the other one, or it dies of malnutrition. Mutualism is when both benefit. Here the water buffalo and the cattle egrets are benefiting from their relationship. The cattle egrets eat the bugs off the water buffalo. The water buffalo benefit from that by getting the parasites taken off, and of course they gain nutrition. Lichens, you should know what a lichen is. All of these are lichens on this branch. It is symbiotic or mutualistic relationship between an algae and a fungus. An algae is providing the fungus with food due to photosynthesis. The fungus provides the algae with a place to live, to reside, protected inside the fungus's tissues. It's a mutualistic, both are benefiting. Commensalism is where one organism benefits and the other one is not harmed. In this case, the barnacles that are coating the various spots on this whale are benefiting by having a place to live. Barnacles have to anchor onto something. The whale does not appear to be particularly benefited or harmed by the barnacles living on it. Okay. So we can look at some other pictures and try to determine what relationship, what we're seeing with the ants. This is an acacia tree, and the ants live inside these thorns, and the acacia tree provides them with a place to live and with food from the leaves, and the ants protect the acacia tree from predators. Again, this is like the water buffalo with the cattle egrets. And this is a symbiotic mutualistic relationship between the pollinator and the flower. The flower gets pollinated, which means that it gets to reproduce, and the bee, of course, gets food. Another mutualistic relationship here with the clownfish and the sea anemones. The clownfish eat little critters that could harm the anemone. The anemone gives the clownfish a nice place to live, plus a food source. Okay. Predation is often a driving force in evolution, and what that means, if you are a prey item, maybe you run fast, but maybe this predator evolves to get faster than you, and so then you have to either evolve to get faster than the predator or you're gonna kick the bucket. So predation, predators adapt to get the prey, and prey adapts to evade the predator. Okay, this is really, we could think of this in terms of something called coevolution, where coevolution is when one species evolves and adapts in response to adaptations that have appeared in another species. For example, this fly, I believe it's a fly, has adapted to fit into this particular type of flower, and it is really the only thing that can pollinate this flower. It's the only thing in its habitat that is able to get to the nectar and the pollen, and that works on this flower. These are thorns. It is an adaptation of this bush to a predator. If a predator evolved that could get past the thorns, then the plant would have to think up something else. Same with these chili peppers. They are adapted to discourage predators from eating them. If a predator does develop a defense against this the hotness of the pepper, then the plant would have to evolve some other means of avoiding being eaten. Okay, camouflage is another type of coevolution, if you will, in that organisms attempt to, well, not attempt, but do gain adaptations that allow them to blend in with their environment, and that environment is often other living things, so they evolve to look like their environment. There's another type of coloration in organisms that actually is warning and causes the organisms to stand out, if you will, even more in their environment, because they are actually trying to advertise that they shouldn't be eaten. This is called aposematic coloration as opposed to camouflage or cryptic coloration. And there are a couple of types of mimicry we'll talk about in association with this, and this is a really some really acute examples of coevolution: Batesian mimicry and Mullerian mimicry. We'll talk about both these coming up. Okay? Alright, so cryptic coloration, that's when you're blending in. You should know that. It's a defense mechanism. Okay? Now, two types of mimicry. Batesian mimicry is when you are probably fairly tasty. This is a caterpillar, a moth larva, and he's probably pretty tasty to a bird. But his body has become adapted to look very much like the snake over here, and this is called Batesian mimicry. And this harmless creature has gained adaptations that allow him to look like a harmful creature and thus avoid predation. He's mimicking that snake. Okay, now another type of an example of Batesian mimicry is the monarch and the viceroy butterfly. This butterfly is toxic. This butterfly is more palatable. They look almost identical, but if a blue jay eats the monarch, he will basically barf it up, and but a viceroy he would not. But it is very advantageous for this guy to look like this guy. Okay, this is an example also, which is the fly, which is the bee. That's the fly, that's the bee. They look really similar. The fly is benefiting from looking like a typical yellow and black striped bee. Over here, which is the moth, which is the bee? Well, this is the bee, but this yellow and black coloration helps to protect the moth, much as the bee is protected, because things understand that that's pretty toxic. Now, Mullerian mimicry is different. In Mullerian mimicry, I don't want to get near this guy, and I don't want to get near this guy. They both will sting me. They are both protected, they both have venom, and they look like each other. Yellow jacket and a type of bee. Why do this? Well, because your predator that you're hoping to teach not to attack you can learn more quickly if he doesn't have to learn a whole bunch of different color patterns. If yellow and black just always means toxic, then these animals benefit from looking like each other. The predators learn more quickly. Yeah. Anyway, so a really common warning coloration or aposematic coloration pattern is this idea of black, red, orange, and yellow. It's seen over and over again to warn predators that these items should not be eaten. This is a great type of mimicry example right here. The king snake is not toxic at all. The coral snake, of course, is deadly. And the little rhyme can help you remember which one is which. Okay. Oh, let me go back. What type of mimicry is that? Is that Batesian or Mullerian? Okay, this guy's harmless, this guy's harmful, so that's Batesian mimicry. Alright, all kinds of examples of coevolution in which organisms evolve in response to each other in their ecological habitat. Okay. This is a great example. This orchid has an attempt to compete. You know, maybe this bee or wasp, I think it's a wasp, would be tempted to pollinate other flowers and not this one, but this has evolved to have this flower structure, which is not, which looks like an insect but is not at all. It's made to look like the female of this wasp species. So this guy thinks he's going to mate with the female. What he's actually doing is pollinating the flower, and he's really not getting any benefit from this at all. He's just pollinating this flower, and he'll go to these in preference to other flowers because he thinks he's going to get to mate with a female, but he's not. He's just pollinating this flower with this decoy female attached to it. Alright, there's a lot of different ways to talk about a community. One of those is just how many different kinds of species are in it. The more diversity you have, the more stable, the better off that community is. And how those species are assembled, which ones are more abundant, which has the most biomass, which ones are most important or does the most hinge on in the community, a keystone species. And we can also talk about how communities change over time, and that's succession. Okay, you ought to be aware that biodiversity is really important in ecosystems. If you have just one type of plant, like in a crop type situation, if something happens to the corn crop, right, one plant, then it might spread to all the others because they're all the same. Whereas if you have lots of diversity, you may lose one type of tree, but you've still got a pretty diverse group of trees to help rebound. Okay, so be aware of the difference between a monoculture, like what we tend to have, thanks to farming and things like that, and more traditional, more natural, old field habitat with lots and lots of different kinds of species in there. Okay. Invasive species, we can talk about invasive species kind of turning areas that were once very diverse into a monoculture because the invasive species have no predators in the area. A keystone species is a species that is really important in keeping the entire ecosystem in balance. Otters are a keystone species in the northern Pacific. They keep the sea urchins in check. If there's no otters, the sea urchins go crazy and eat up all the kelp, and so that can get to be very obviously out of balance ecosystem. Okay. Beaver are a keystone species in the communities where they exist because of their engineering and building capabilities. They can create entire new habitats and new ecosystems in an area, and without them, obviously things change dramatically, and with them things change dramatically. All right. We need to understand what succession is, and that's change in the composition of an ecosystem over time. There are two types, primary and secondary. Primary means you are starting out your ecosystem with absolutely nothing. Like perhaps we're talking about a volcanic island that has nothing but rock, nothing has ever lived on it before. But slowly bacteria will begin to colonize in the rock. Then you might have lichens and mosses whose spores get blown to the island over time. Those organisms begin to make soil out of the rock. They'll degrade the rock and make little tiny bits of soil. Once you get soil, then grass seeds that might be blown or carried by birds can take root. Once you get grasses, you break up the rocks even more, creating more soil. As grass decomposes, then you might get shrubbery and trees again as seeds get delivered to the island. And all of these things follow in succession, one after the other, if the environment can support them. Okay? These guys, because they help create soil and colonize an uninhabited area, are called pioneer species. Okay, and so they make the environment suitable for other organisms, kind of like the pioneers did here as they moved out west. Now, secondary succession, you're not starting out with nothing. You're starting out with a habitat that is right here on this scale, that once had a forest, but it was destroyed by fire. So you still have soil, which is something that you don't have in primary succession. Your pioneer species come in, and eventually you get the climax community over time. So this is showing you how this plot of land would look after a couple of years, after 150 years, after more than 150 years. You would have gone from this to this. And that's the big, most complex community that this place could support, a climax community. Okay, that's secondary succession. You're not starting out with nothing, you're at least starting out with soil, and that means that this would be much faster than primary succession. Okay, so again, just photographs talking about what kinds of succession, what the different communities might look like, and understand that these organisms, just by existing, alter their environment and sometimes cause their own demise. For example, these guys start really creating soil and so on, which then invites these guys to come in and cause the environment not to be very hospitable to these guys anymore. And so these grasses and whatnot, then start creating environment that might be more conducive to shrubbery, and then the shrubbery starts to block out the sunlight so that these guys who need high sunlight in order to survive can't survive anymore. So the ones, and so on to the big climax community, which is the most complex and stable community that a particular ecosystem can support. Ours is a deciduous forest, but in the tundra, that climate can only support fairly limited plant life, and so its climax community is the moss and the lichen that we typically see. And the caribou that can feed off that. All right, finally, we've just talked about that, how early species facilitate habitat change. All these changes may allow other species to come in and then outcompete those earlier species. Okay? There are some species that can't survive without destruction. Interestingly, fire climax species. For example, these are jack pine trees, and their seeds are in these cones that will not open unless they are exposed to fire. So you have to have a fire to come in to get these new seeds to open. And if fire is suppressed, then these jack pines will not thrive and give rise to new jack pines, and eventually the adults will die of old age, and they won't thrive, and that can disrupt the organisms that are dependent on these for life, like these little warblers. Their numbers severely declined as fires were being suppressed in these jack pine forests to prevent forest fires. Okay, that's it. We will be on to podcast 3 in your review. I hope that if you've got any questions, I hope you'll ask me in class. Thanks a lot.